But when that message came, the Earl brought it before his friends and councillors. After that he calls thither Earl Thorfinn's messengers. Rudenwald says, that is for that lot of the Isles which they claim, he had taken it in fief from King Magnus, and that the king called it his father's heritage. Now he said King Magnus had power to say which of them should own that lot. But he said he would not let it go if it were the king's will that he should have it. On this the messengers fared away, and tell Earl Thorfinn those words. They said, too, it was surely to be looked for that this would not be got without a struggle. But when Earl Thorfinn heard that, he grew very wrath, and said it was a likely story that King Magnus was to have his brother's heritage. He said, too, that had been agreed to more because he and Earl Brassy were then come into King Olaf's grasp than because it was a fair and rightful sharing of the inheritance. Now methinks Rudenwald doth not repay me well when I have now let him have that realm in freedom for a while. If I shall not now come near the heritage my brother has left me unless I fight for it. Earl Thorfinn was so wrath at this, that no long time after he sends men into the southern Isles, and up into Scotland, and drew a force together. He gave it out too, that he meant to come to blows with Earl Rudenwald, and then take that without forbearance which he could not get when he sought for it in peace. And now, when this is told to Earl Rudenwald, that Earl Thorfinn was gathering a force against him, he summoned his friends about him, and moots this with them, that Earl Thorfinn his kinsman means to come to blows with him with a host and strife. He asked then what force they will furnish him with, and says he is not willing to lose his own without one trial of strength. But when he begged for their judgment on this matter, then men gave it in very different ways. Some spoke after Earl Rudenwald, and said it was to be forgiven him that he did not wish to share his realm. But there were some who said it was to be forgiven to Thorfinn that he wished to have the realm for a while, when Rudenwald had already had that lot which Earl Einar had owned. They said, too, it was bad counsel that Rudenwald should lay himself out to fight against Thorfinn with that force which he could get from 2 lots of the Isles, when Thorfinn had a Trything and Caithness, and a great share of Scotland and all the southern Isles. There were men, too, who spoke and said that a peaceful settlement must be sought, who begged that Rudenwald would offer Earl Thorfinn half of the Isles, and so in that way their kinship might still be saved. But when Rudenvale found that each had a way of his own, but all were against his resisting, then he laid bare his will, and said that he will not cut his realm asunder by any settlement. That he would far rather give up the realm at once, and go to seek King Magnus his foster brother, and look after what strength the king will give him to hold his realm. After that he makes ready for his voyage, and fares east to Norway, nor does he slacken his course before he comes into the presence of King Magnus. And when he is come thither, he tells the king the whole story. The king made Earl Rudenwald good cheer, and bade him be with him so long as he liked, and to take a fief of him so large that he could well maintain himself and his people. But Earl Rudenwald told the king that he wished he would give him strength enough to seek back his realm. King Magnus said of a surety he would aid him with strength to get what he asked. Rudenwald stayed a short time in Norway ere he began his voyage west to the Orkneys. He had then many picked men whom King Magnus had granted him, and this went with him too. He thinking send word to Calvarni's son, that he should have his lands and leave to live in Norway, if he would stand by Earl Rudenwald in this quarrel between him and Earl Thorfinn. 1. The Florida heads this chapter with the following passage. King Olaf, Harold's son, got no service from Earl Thorfinn, since they parted after Earl Brassy, and they came to a settlement altogether. 2. Florida they were slower about an onslaught. 3. Florida and get all his fleet of ships under way as fast as they could, take to their oars and row away. 4. The Moray Firth. 5. The Scourge of Serpents the winter. 6. With hooded head, very secretly. 7. When they parted in a thicket. 8. Homegird, probably Novgorod. 9. Thambaskelfer, Paunch Shaker, from his fatness, or good archer, strength-wonger, for his skill with the bow. 10. Aldigeborg, the berg on the Aldega, or Ladoga Lake. 11. A firth in the Isle of Skye. 12. Forest foeman, fire. 31. Earl Ragnvald sailed from Norway west towards the Orkneys, and made Shetland from the sea, and drew force to himself, and thence fared south into the Orkneys. There he summoned his friends to meet him, and gathered force thence. Earl Thorfinn was over in Caithness, and news came to him at once of Ragnvald's doings, and he drew force to himself from Scotland and the southern isles. Earl Ragnvald sent at once the message of King Magnus to Calvarni's son, and Calf took in a kind way all that the king had spoken. Earl Ragnvald drew his host together in the Orkneys, and meant to cross over into the Ness. But when he came into the Pentland Firth, then he had 30 warships, all big and in good trim. There came against him Earl Thorfinn, and had 60 ships, and most of them small. Their meeting was off the Red Head, and they ran into battle at once. There, too, was come Calvarni's son, and had 6 ships, and all great, and did not run into the fight. And now arises the hardest battle. Either Earl egged on his people. But when things had gone on so for a while, the loss of men turns on Earl Thorfinn's side, and that was most because the difference in the height of the ship's sides was great. Thorfinn had a great ship, and in good trim, and in that he ran forward most bravely. But when the decks of the smaller ships were cleared, then the Earl's ship was run aboard of on both sides, and then they stood in very great need. Then numbers of men fell on board the Earl's ship, but some were very badly wounded. Earl Ragnvald then egged on his men to board. But when Earl Thorfinn saw into what a bad plight they were come, he made them cut his ship away from her lashings and row to land. He made them bear out of his ship 70 corpses. There, too, went out all those who were unfight-worthy for their wounds' sake. Then Earl Thorfinn begged Arne Earl Skald to go out of the ship. He was in the Earl's train, and held in great love. He went on shore and chanted a song. This man is loath to go against Brussi's son, one's lord to follow. Is good, that lesson to the people. Ne'er shall I be found gainsaying. Hard the choice we have before us. If these earls so full of fury fall to blows, a time of trial, for friendship we shall surely see. Earl Thorfinn mans his ship with the best men he had left. After that he fares to find Calf, and asked him for help. He said thus, that Calf could not get bought back the friendship of King Magnus when he had already been forced to flee out of the land. When thou foundest it no good that thou hadst already been taken into very great love, so mayest thou make up thy mind, if Ragnvald is victorious over us, and if the power of King Magnus and of him spreads here over the western sea, that then thou wilt not be welcome here. But if we win the day, then nothing shall fall short to you that I have power to give. We two shall be at no man's mercy here across the western sea, if we two are both of one mind. And thou wilt not surely like to have that on your mind that thou liest here like a cat in a cave, while I fight for the freedom of us both. Besides, there are those ties between us two, that it beseems each of us better to lend the other help, since men who are bound to you by no ties are against us. But when Calf heard the egging on of Thorfinn, he called on his men, and bade them put out to battle together with Earl Thorfinn. As Jarnegil Brar Skald says, we have heard, O Calf, to Hurley, how Finn's son-in-law thou followedst, and thy war snakes o'er the waters swiftly swept against the Earl, gold-begetter, vengeance mindful, all unwilling to attack Brussi's son so bold in battle. Thorfinn had thy help at last. Now they made an onslaught by rowing, both of them together, Earl Thorfinn and Calf. And when they came to the fight, Thorfinn's host was ready to flee, but very many of them were fallen. The Earl ran his ship against the ship of Earl Ragnvald, and there arose the hardest fight. So says Arner. I saw both my gold bestowers, each the other's henchman hewing, on the fitful firth of Pentland. Thence my grief grew more and more. Sea was blood-stained, black kept dripping. Gore between the gaping seams. Sweat was shed on rim of shield. All the sides with blood were dabbled. Calf ran up against the smaller ships of Ruttenvold and cleared their decks quickly, for there was a great difference in the height of their sides. But when the levies who had come from Norway saw ships cleared hard by them, they then loosed their ships from their lashings and laid themselves out to fly, so that scarce a ship was left behind with the Earl's ship. Then the fight began to turn. So says Arner Earlskald. The Lord, so brave in burst of battle, then had surely laid beneath him all that ancient land of Orkney. He had far less loss of men. If the Sea King's son of Endil could have brought that host to help him, island-born, but Shetland's lord, by his army was betrayed. And now that the main host had fled, then they, Calf and Thorfinn, both ran aboard of Earl Ruttenvold's ship, and then many men of Earl Ruttenvold's fell. And when Earl Ruttenvold saw in what a strait he was come, and that he could not conquer Thorfinn and Calf both, then he made them hew the lashings asunder, and laid himself out to fly. Then the day was far spent, and it began to grow dark. Earl Ruttenvold sailed at once that night into the main, and so east to Norway. He did not slacken his course till he came into King Magnus' presence. He made him welcome now as before, and bade him be with him. And there Earl Ruttenvold stayed a while. 32. Now it is to be said of Earl Thorfinn, that on the morning after the fight he made them row about all the isles to search for the men who had fled. Many were slain, but some came to terms of peace. Then Earl Thorfinn laid under him all the isles, and made every man come into his hand, and those as well who had been before bound by an oath to Ruttenvold. He sat himself up then in the Orkneys with a very great band of men, and drew his supplies from Caithness on the other side. But Calfarni's son, he sends into the Southland Isles, and let him sit there as a means of strength for himself. But when Earl Ruttenvold had stayed in Norway a while with King Magnus, he said to the king that he would try back to the Orkneys. But when the king heard that, he called it unwise to fare before the winter abated and ice loosened and the sea began to thaw. Said he then would give him ships and crews as many as he needed. Ruttenvold speaks thus, and said now he was not willing to lose King Magnus' men. Said, too, that it could not be carried out unless with great loss of men, if he gathered a host to come to blows with Thorfinn and Karl, such a large realm as they have there west. I mean now, he said, to hold on west with one ship, and to man it as well as I can. Then I ween that no news of us will be borne before us. Then it will either be, that we shall come upon them unawares, and then we may speedily win that victory which we should win hardly or not at all with a great force. But if they become aware of our voyage, then we will let the sea still take care of us. King Magnus bade him fare as he liked, but to come back to him again as soon as he chose. And after that Earl Ruttenvold makes ready his voyage, and takes pains in choosing men to go with him. And some of the king's bodyguard made up their minds to go with him. Then he had a picked force. And when they were bound they sailed away to sea. That was about the beginning of winter. 33. Earl Ruttenvold made Shetland from the sea. Then he learned that Earl Thorfinn was in the Orkneys, and had no very great force with him. He had then no fear of war in high winter. Now Ruttenvold held on straightway south to the Orkneys. Earl Thorfinn was then in Hrossey, and had no fear for himself. But as soon as Ruttenvold came into the Orkneys he held on thither where he heard Thorfinn was, and came upon him so unawares, that nothing was heard of them before they had seized all the doors of the house which Thorfinn and his men were in. It was night then, and most men were asleep, but the Earl sat then still a-drinking. Ruttenvold and his men bore fire to the homestead. But when Earl Thorfinn was ware of the strife, he sent men to the doors and let them ask, who had sway over the strife. Then it was said that Earl Ruttenvold was come thither. Then men sprung to their arms. Then nothing could be done in the way of defense, because outlet was shut to all. The house began soon to blaze. Thorfinn gave counsel that men should beg for leave to go of the Earl, and he allowed it to all women and unfree men, but said most of Earl Thorfinn's bodyguard would be no better to him alive than dead. So those men were drawn out to whom peace was given, and then the whole house was soon burning. Earl Thorfinn broke away a wainscot panel at the back of the house, and sprung out there. He had Ingiborg his wife in his arms. The night was pitch dark and moonless, and he got away under the smoke, so that the Earl's men were not ware of him. He rode at once that night alone in a boat over to the Ness. Earl Ragnvald burned down the whole homestead, and all those men who were inside it, to whom leave was not given to go out. Now no man thought anything else than that Earl Thorfinn had lost his life there. After this Earl Ragnvald fared about over all the isles and laid them under him. He sent also those words over to Caithness and to the southern isles, that he meant to claim all that realm that Earl Thorfinn had owned. No man gainsayed him in this. Earl Thorfinn was in divers places in hiding in Caithness with his friends, and no news went abroad that he had got away from the burning. 34. Earl Ragnvald sat in Kirkwall, and drew thither the stores which he needed to have for his winter quarters. He had a great band of men, and much good cheer. But a little before Yule Earl Ragnvald fared with a great following into the little Papi to fetch malt, to be brewed for Yule. And at even, as they were on the isle, they sate long over a roasting fire, and he who made up the fire spoke and said that the fire would begin to fall short. Then the Earl made a slip of the tongue, and these were the words he spoke: "Then are we full old when these fires are burned out." But he meant so to have spoken, that they would then be full warmed. And as soon as ever he found it out, he said, "I have not made a slip of the tongue before this, so that I call it to mind. It comes into my mind what King Olaf my foster father said at Stickelstead when I took him up for a slip of the tongue. If it ever happens that I made a slip of the tongue, I might make up my mind that I should then have but a short time unlived. May be that my kinsman Thorfinn is yet alive." And just then they heard how that the homestead was girt round by men. There was come Earl Thorfinn. They bore fire at once to the house, and laid up a pile of fuel before the doors. They allowed all to go out save the Earl's men. And when most of the men were drawn out, a man went out into the doorway in linen underclothes, and begged Earl Thorfinn to stretch out his hand toward the deacon. But that man rested his hands on the balk of wood across the doorway, and vaulted out over the balk and the ring of men, so that he came down ever so far off all of them, and was lost in the darkness of night. Thorfinn bade them hold on after him, and says, "There went Earl Ragnvald, this is his nimbleness, and no one's else." Then they fared to hunt for him, and parted themselves into companies. And Thorkel Fosterer went along the seashore to search. They heard how a dog barked among the rocks on the seashore. Earl Ragnvald had his lapdog with him, and he betrayed the Earl. They put him to death at once among the rocks, and it is the story of some men that Thorkel Fosterer slew him, because there were no other men who would do it. But he had sworn to do all those deeds which seemed to Thorfinn more for his realm's safety than otherwise. Thorfinn and his men stayed that night on the isle, and there all the train that had followed Ragnvald thither were slain. But the morning after they took a ship of burden and laded her with malt. After that they went on board, and left the shields at stem and prow which Ragnvald and his men had owned. They let, too, no more men be seen in the ship than had followed the Earl. Then they rode to Kirkwall. And when the followers of Ragnvald who were in the town saw that, they thought that their Earl Ragnvald must be coming and his men. Then they went to meet him, and most of them unarmed. Earl Thorfinn let them there take about 30 men and slay them. They were most of them of King Magnus' bodyguard and his friends. The Earl gave peace to one of King Magnus' bodyguard, and bade that man fare east to Norway and tell these tidings to King Magnus. 35. The body of Earl Ragnvald was carried to the greater Papi, and there buried. and it was the saying of men that he has been by far the best bred man, and with most friends of all the Orkney earls, and his death was a great grief to many a man. After that Earl Thorfinn laid all the isles under him, and now no man gainsayed him in that. Early in the spring came these tidings east to Norway, and King Magnus thought the loss of Ragnvald, his foster brother, the greatest scathe, and said he would avenge him as soon as ever he had time. But he had at that time great strife with King Sweyn Ulfson, who had then let himself be chosen to be king over Denmark. 36. At that time came into Norway Harald Sigurd's son, the kinsman of King Magnus, and King Magnus gave him half Norway. They were both kings in Norway one winter. Then they called out a levy over all Norway and meant to go south to Denmark. But when they lay in the Isles, 2 long ships ran into the haven, and up to King Magnus' ship. A man went from the long ship in a white cowl, and aft along the ship and up into the poop. The king sate over meat. This man hailed the king, and bowed before him, took up a loaf of bread, and broke a bit off and ate. The king took his greeting, and reached out to him the bowl when he saw that he ate the bread. This man took the bowl, and said, "We want peace, messmate." The king looked at him, and said, "Who art thou?" "I am Thorfinn, Sigurd's son." "Art thou Earl Thorfinn?" says the king. "So I am called west yonder," says he, "but I am come hither with 2 ships of 20 benches each, and rather well manned, so far as we are able. Now I will row on this levy with you, if ye will take help of me. But all my matter and I myself shall be at God's command and yours, Lord, for the sake of those great misdeeds which I have broken against your will." Then men went up and heard their talk. The king was slow in answering, and spoke thus: "True it is, Earl Thorfinn, that I had not meant, if the meeting of us 2 ever took place as it has now done, that thou shouldest be able to tell of our parting. But now things have happened so, that it beseems not my honor that I should take and kill thee. Now thou shalt fare with me. But the terms of our atonement I will utter at my leisure." Earl Thorfinn bade the king goodbye, and went to his ships. The king lay a very long time in the Isles. Then a host gathered thither to him out of the bay. He meant to sail thence south under Jutland as soon as he got a fair wind. Earl Thorfinn was then often long a talking with the king.
The king treated him well, and took him much into his counsels. It fell out one day that the earl went on board the king's ship, and ept into the poop. The king bade him sit by him. The earl sat him down, and they both drank together and were merry. The tall brisk man in a red kirtle came into the poop. That man hailed the king. The king took his greeting lightly. That was one of the king's bodyguard. This man began to speak, and said, "Thee am I come to find, Earl Thorfinn." "What wilt thou of me?" says the earl. "I want to know with what thou wilt atone to me for my brother, whom thou lett'st to be slain west in Kirkwall, along with other thanes of King Magnus." "Hast thou not heard that," says the earl, "that I am not one to atone for those men with money whom I cause to be slain? And this is how it is, that methinks I have always had good cause when I have let men be slain. It is no business of mine how thou hast done by other men, if thou atonest for this one, on whose behalf I make this claim. Besides, I left behind me there some goods of my own, and for myself I was shamefully treated. I have the best right, therefore, to make this claim in my brother's name and my own, and I will have amends for it." But the king may as well forgive everything that is done against him, if he thinks it nothing worth when his thanes are let out and hewn down like sheep. The earl answers, "I see plainly that it is all the better for me here that thou hast not had power over me. Art thou not that man to whom I gave peace yonder?" "Sure enough I am," says he. "It was in thy choice to slay me there and then like other men." Then the earl answers, "Sooth it is, as the saying goes, that many things happen that one least looks for. I thought then that I could never be so placed that I should have to pay for being too peaceable to my foes, but now I am too smart for having given thee mercy. Thou wouldst not be able to cry out against me today before princes if I had let thee be slain like the rest of thy companions." The king looked at the earl and said, There it comes out though, Earl Thorfinn, that thou thinkest thou hast slain too few of my thanes without atonement. The king was then as red as blood. The earl sprang up then, and went down out of the poop and on board his ship. Then all was quiet that evening. But next morning, when men were woke, a fair breeze was come. Then men rowed straightway out of the haven. The king sailed then south into Jutland Sea with all the fleet. The earl's ship sailed a good deal westward to the open sea at the beginning of the day, but when the day began to wear away, the earl steered west into the main. There is nothing to be said about him before he came to the Orkneys and sate down there in his realm. King Magnus and Harald sailed to Denmark, and stayed there that summer. King Sweyn would not come out to meet them. He was in Skandar with his host. In that summer King Magnus took that sickness which led him to his death. He gave it out then before all the people that he gave all the realm of Norway to his father's brother Harald. For 37. Earl Thorfinn now ruled over the Orkneys and all the rest of his realms. Calf, our nice son, was also mostly with him. Sometimes he went west sea roving, and harried the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. He was also in England, and was for a while over the Thingnes band. When Earl Thorfinn heard of the death of King Magnus, he sent then men east to Norway to find King Harald and greet him with friendly words. He says, thus, that he wishes to become his friend. But when that message came to the king, he took it well, and the king promised him his friendship. And when this message came back to the earl, he made ready his voyage, and had with him from the west 2 ships of 20 benches each, and more than 100 men, all fine picked fellows. Then he fared east to Norway, and found the king in Hordaland. He gave him a very hearty welcome, and at their parting the king gave him good gifts. Thence the earl sailed south along the land, and so to Denmark. There he fared round the land, and found King Sweyn in Aalborg. He asked the earl to his house, and made him a grand feast. Then the earl laid bare his purpose how he meant to go south to Rome. But when he came to Saxony, he met there the Kaiser Henry, and he gave the earl a very hearty welcome, and gave him many great gifts. He got him, too, many horses, and then he made ready his journey south. Then he fared to Rome and saw the Pope there, and there he took absolution from him for all his misdeeds. The earl turned thence to his journey home, and came back safe and sound into his realm, and that journey was most famous. Then the earl sat down quietly and kept peace over all his realm. Then he left off warfare, then he turned his mind to ruling the people and land, and to law-giving. He sate almost always in Piercy Eve, and let them build their Christ Church, a splendid minster. There first was set up a bishop's seat in the Orkneys. Earl Thorfinn had 2 wife and your girls Smalter. They had 2 sons, who grew up out of childhood. The name of one was Paul and the other's Erland. They were tall men and fair, and took more after their mother's side. They were men wise and meek. The earl loved them much, and so too did all the people. 38. Earl Thorfinn held all his realms till his death day. It is simply said that he has been the most powerful of all the Orkney earls. He owned 9 earldoms in Scotland, and all the southern isles, and he had a great realm in Ireland. So says Arnir Earlscald. All the way from Tiscarskerry down to Dublin hosts obeyed him. Royal Thorfinn, Raven Peter. True I tell how liegemen loved him. Earl Thorfinn was then 5 winters old when Malcolm the Scalp King, his mother's father, gave him the title of Earl, but afterwards he was 65 winters Earl. He breathed his last about the end of King Harold Thickorn's son's days. He is buried at Christ Church in Piercy Eve, which he left rebuilt. The earl's death was a great grief in the Orkneys and in his lands of heritage. But in those lands which he had laid under him with war, then many thought it great thraldom to abide under his power. Then many realms fell away which the earl had laid under him, and men looked for trust under those chiefs who were their home born to rule in those realms. So losses were very soon plainly seen when Earl Thorfinn fell away. These songs were sung about the battle between Earl Rogval the Bruise's son, and Earl Thorfinn. Loath am I to tell the story, how eyewitness was when men broke the truce between the earls. Equal corpses got the corpus off the isles the mighty monarch. Toward the sea's blue tent in twain. Storm cold waters then were stiffened, striking ships with buffets sword. Hard mishap uprose triumphant, as the earls in onslaught strove. Many a man then learned the lesson, how to fall in bloody fight. Hard beneath the headland ruddy, hardy friends of ours fought. Storm of spear points followed after, many mild folk there met grief. Gloom o'er gleaming sun shall gather, earth neath billowed black bemerged, Austria's burden 6 break to pieces, main sea mount above the mountains. There among those isles of error Cheaton shall again be born, Thorfinn trusty lord of fanes long may God him guard alive.